This is Face the Erespora, a platform for conversations on Eritrea. Your host, Wissam Mesfin.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Face the Erespora. Our guest today is a longtime friend of Eritrea, Mr. Dan Connell. Dan Connell is a visiting scholar at Boston University's African Studies Center and a retired senior lecturer in journalism and African politics at Simmons College. A veteran reporter, Dan Connell's articles have appeared in numerous print and broadcast media publications, including the BBC, Voice of America, AP, Reuters, and the Boston Globe. Dan Connell founded Grassroots International and has consulted for many other development agencies and human rights groups. He's the author of several books on Eritrea, including Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners. Dan, I'm delighted to welcome you to the program. What is the current situation in Eritrea from your vantage point? What is the general impression out there? How are people perceiving the situation in the country?
Well, I think the situation in the country from the viewpoint outside, which has its limits, of course, is not very different than it's been for quite some time. The country remains under the very tight control of a very small core of the leadership. Political situation has not moved an inch in years. The economy continues to slide, with the exception of remittances and diaspora taxes and contributions. The only thing that's generating any significant income, of course, is the mining, and nobody has any clue where that money is going since nothing's published about it. The flow of people leaving the country has not slowed down. If anything, actually, it's speeded up. And I think that's a function of the clear combination of the political situation and the economy. The one thing that does seem to have changed is the recognition that this situation, as stable as it's been over these many years, is not going to last forever. And I think that events of the last 2 years have brought that into focus for many people, inside and outside, and particularly in the international community. And I would take that back to 2012 with the situation that began to develop after March, when Ethiopia launched attacks into Eritrea against the military bases. And really, for the first time, I think that any of us can remember, there was no response. And in fact, the one response there was that Isaias disappeared from view for several months. That started many people wondering just what's going on. How much is he fully in control of the situation? And to what extent has the military itself been degraded by this constant flow of people outside? That and then Melis's passing as well later on that year brought into focus the fact that all these leaders, no matter how firmly entrenched they appear, are mortal. Take that into 2013 and the events of January, the Forto incident, the first clear signal that there was significant dissension within the armed forces. Perhaps not enough to change the situation, but enough to at least send up a kind of flare over the country that said everything may look absolutely under control, but perhaps it's not. I think that I hear in various capitals, people and particularly in Europe, talking about re-engaging with Eritrea out of a sense that perhaps a transition could be in the offing, or at least incrementally building, even at this point. Nobody has any sense of how long that will take or what will be on the other side of it. But the notion that that things may finally be in some small way moving toward something new has galvanized, I think, more attention to the country.
Just one point, though. Remittances from Eritreans have actually decreased significantly over the last couple of years. But moving on, Dan, is there a concern out there that you can discern that things might deteriorate even further than is the case right now?
Well, I think, yeah, clearly there has been a decline in remittances. I think, nonetheless, it's the lifeline that tends to keep the regime afloat. There's a third piece to this, too, and that is the economic and trade actions, agreements, sort of adventures that the regime, and particularly, of course, the PFDJ is involved in the region that we don't have a clear record of because, again, there's no published budget. But this is a situation that is becoming increasingly desperate on a number of counts. The economy is, of course, one of them. The hemorrhaging of the younger generation and the outflow of people is beginning, I think, to have a clear impact on the country at many levels. One of them that I already mentioned is the weakening of the armed forces themselves. But I think that this is also a clear message coming out that the country can't lose 15 to 20% of its population and survive.
Dan, clearly the government cannot be happy with the UN decision to continue the sanctions indefinitely. It seems it's increasingly cornered in every which way. Does it now hunker down and retreat into a cocoon, or it's bound to come out swinging and perhaps even reform itself? My question actually is, has it gotten beyond a point of repair, or the system is capable of repairing its ways?
Well, I don't think you're going to see a change in Isaias or in his leadership ever. He is so thoroughly in a kind of bubble of his own creation that I'm not sure how much he's aware of the desperation of the country itself. People around him, I think, are. And I have been hearing stories about feelers going out to quite a number of European countries to, as I said, to re-engage with Eritrea. So I think there is, the sanctions have hurt. The isolation has hurt. And in one sense, in one way, of course, this is the product of the country's own policies. And it has thumbed its nose at the international community over and over and over again, damned everybody with the result that there is not that much respect for the regime. But there is, I think, a growing sense among many countries that there may be a wedge there. There's also pressure coming, particularly within Europe, on these governments there by right-wing anti-immigrant forces that are trying to cut down on the flow of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants coming into their countries. And Eritreans are right up there with the Syrians as one of the largest numbers of people coming into Europe. So there are a variety of factors that are encouraging a kind of re-engagement. Now, what would that have to look like? Well, were the present regime to attempt an internal reform of itself, a number of things would have to happen, and the demands have already been out there ever since Forto for everybody to know. They are constitutional rule, the release of political prisoners, and the scaling back of national service, and taking it back to 18 months and releasing many of the people who are in it now. What does this country do with the economy that it has and the limitations it's placed on its own educational system to reabsorb people being demobilized or even returning. There's no way that the government could stand to take that kind of a challenge without being completely transformed, and I don't see that happening under the present leadership. It would have to lead to some form of larger transition that would include a lot of people outside the PFDJ, which, of course, until now has been an utter impossibility.
Dan, perhaps one of the greatest blows the Isaias dictatorship has ever received is the recent appointment of the Human Rights Commission to investigate alleged human rights abuses by the government. Individual members of the PFDJ can ultimately be held accountable for documented abuses perpetrated against Eritreans. Shouldn't this alarm every senior leader all the way up to and including the president?
Well, I think it does alarm them. I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing the outreach that's going on now. This is an outgrowth of a steady process of alienation from the international community, and I think it's really the next step. Now, the investigation can really only come up with a report. The real thing they would have to worry about would be taking it another step, which would be to the International Criminal Court, if there are found to be crimes against humanity and so on. I think that there is concern there, and they're scrambling to try to head that thing off, and I think it's already gone past the point where they can.
While there is a rapidly increasing population of Eritreans who would like this regime gone, one also senses a genuine concern of a need for a bloodless transition. Dan, based on your lengthy grasp of the culture of the PFDJ, what do you predict, if anyone can predict that is, are some of the potential scenarios that are bound to unfold as the leadership senses that it has effectively alienated its own people?
Well, I think hazarding predictions of Eritrea's future is a very risky business. The one thing that I think we have seen over the years is that change does evolve on a much slower pace than it may in some other situations. In this situation, I don't doubt at all that those in the internal core leadership are aware of the pressures building on them and the isolation that they're in. How they move from this point, is a matter of how other people act toward them at the same time. There are two things that Eritreans are clearly concerned about. One is a violent outcome of a transition within the country. The second one clearly is the interference of Ethiopia from outside. And if the international community, for its part, is concerned about the potential for instability in the area, which I can assure you they are, this is a very strategic area, and instability creates openings for very dangerous trends and tendencies in that part of the world. If the international community were concerned about this, there are steps that should be taken to reassure Eritrea and Eritreans that the country's sovereignty will be respected and defended at an international level under any conditions. I think that would be a very important step. I would also think that movement on the border issue would be a way of isolating the regime further and stripping it of the rationale it has for maintaining this perpetual state of emergency. The unfortunate thing is that I think that many people have so lost patience with the regime and lost hope in the possibility that it can, as you asked about, reform itself, that there isn't much of an impetus for that kind of pressure. And I think that's unfortunate, because that, of course, is another aspect of this. Were the border issue off the table, I think Eritreans would rapidly resolve the situation inside the country.
Dan, as you can imagine, this is a difficult question to ask. A whole lot of Eritreans, both at home and in the diaspora, are still, one can say, in a state of shock or even trauma by the tragedy in Lampedusa. The human trafficking in Sinai and across the Horn and North Africa has become quite a lucrative market originating from the heart of Eritrea. Whatever happened to the promise of a government that was supposed to be free of corruption? Why such cruelties to human suffering?
The situation has been one of the steady breakdown of order and ethics within the country, and I think that should shock every Eritrean, because the regime is justifying its continued rule by saying it's defending the nation, and yet as we look at the situation, you see the nation itself is being corrupted from within and is beginning to disintegrate, as so many people have left and gone through so much trauma on the way out that they may never go back. The corruption involved in the participation of individuals in the transport of people out is truly appalling. And the stories come up over and over again. It's not only the regime, though. I have been interviewing quite a number of refugees about their departure from the country, and there are a number of things that jump out at me from the accumulation of evidence from the various stories that I've been hearing. First of all, the situation inside has steadily deteriorated to the point where the culture of the armed forces and of the regime itself clearly has become one so wedded to violence that it's almost unrecognizable from that of the earlier era. That people tell stories of being shuttled from one prison to the other. In fact, the list of prisons is mind-boggling. And being treated at every level, almost as if they are enemies of the country for the most minor infractions. This is a level of corruption of the integrity of the nation itself that ought to concern people as much as the corruption that's reflected in the involvement in transporting people out. Once people do get out, they follow circuitous routes to try to find safe haven that take them in every direction from Eritrea, out, of course, into Sudan and Ethiopia, from there to South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, other countries in Southern Africa, up to North Africa and across to Europe, and up to Egypt and Alexandria, and efforts to get into Europe through other pathways. Each one of these involves enormous risks, and almost all of them involve Eritreans who are helping to smuggle them out, often at enormous profits. This is a level of corruption, too, that is infecting the larger society. And it all emanates from, of course, the situation inside. Change that, and things can start to change elsewhere. But there's a lot of healing and a lot of hard struggle that has to go on, given the depths to which this situation has descended.
Former PFDJ Ambassador Anda Burhan wrote in his recent book, holding the president squarely responsible for the current situation in the country. My question is, does the removal of Isaias Afwerki remove the problem, or one has to aspire to uproot the system from its foundations?
Well, I think you're actually asking them probably the most important question that faces the country and the people right now. I have read Andebrhan's book, and I found it quite interesting and illuminating in many areas. I think that it is quite clear that many of the problems in Eritrea, going all the way back to the 1960s and 70s, can be at least in part attributed to the leadership of Isaias Afwerki. But he is one person, and he has managed to surround himself over and over again with some very dynamic, strong, and powerful people, sometimes very creative and sometimes very destructive. He has managed to continue to purge those who get too strong or too powerful, or who perhaps question his leadership, and replace them by new generations. Each time he does, these people who come into that inner circle have to be aware of what happened before them, and everybody who has participated in that bears some share of responsibility, because there is, I think, as you correctly said, a system in place here headed by one person who has done a lot of very bad things. But the system itself has infused the culture and corrupted many people around it. I think that to remove Isaias from that position would be the first step in a long process that would have to involve a clear acceptance of responsibility by everybody who has participated in this. And I truly, I mean everybody. If you go back to the essay that I wrote in 2003, titled Enough, which has been circulating out in the web for a long time, I also criticized myself for standing too close to a regime where I saw warning signs and set them aside for a variety of reasons until it had gotten so out of hand in 2000 and 2001 that it was impossible to ignore. I think all of us who have participated in this, no matter how deeply or how much, needs to examine ourselves, take a look at the roles that we played, either in participating in some of the very destructive actions of the regime, or in staying silent about them. Not perhaps as bad, but one step away from doing it yourself. And I think that after the regime changes at the top, that process of unpacking what happened, who did what to whom, and not necessarily for punishment purposes. I think vengeance can be as corrupting as the process we're just describing. But for shedding the impact of that through a kind of catharsis that the whole nation needs to go through. I think in the process there are clearly a number of people at the very inner core who, at the very least, should be disqualified from playing a role in the leadership of the country. But after that, you have to start asking, what does someone have to do to take responsibility for what they did before and to move on and help build the country? And here I think it's instructive for people to take a look at some of the other countries that have gone through these kinds of things. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process, Argentina's Truth and Reconciliation, and there are many others. The situation in Iraq, for example, when the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein was thrown out, evolved very quickly into a kind of purging of everybody who was involved in the Ba'ath Party. And as a result, the country fell apart. So did the armed forces, and it still hasn't come back together again. So there's an example of maybe going too far and holding too many people responsible. But somewhere between that and isolating this and saying, oh, it's one bad guy, get rid of him and everything will be different, is where the truth will lie.
Dan, perhaps one of the most reassuring characters one senses about Eritreans is actually forgiving, perhaps too forgiving, which might have been costly to the country. But moving on.
There's a really big difference between forgiving and forgetting. And I think that as many people in other situations like this have said, we can forgive, but we should never forget.
Do you have any contact with members of the government at this time, or you're frozen like everybody else?
It's pretty cold out here. Rasum, I have had a couple of situations where I've been in forums where government representatives have been there, including ambassadors. And I think that has been more by circumstance than by design, but it's been a very interesting opportunity. I've also been at a number of forums, as you well know, over the last year where YPFDJ and PFDJ supporters have shown up and done their very best to shout down the moderator and close the events down. Not much dialogue going on there. What I would say is that I think that if anybody who is concerned about the future and a future that is inclusive, which is a precondition, of course, for peace and stability, anybody who shares that point of view and wants to talk, I'm more than ready to talk to them.
Well, behind the scenes, Dan, has anybody attempted to reach out to you to communicate with you in an email, a text, or some form of communication where folks expressed a desire to actually talk with you?
No, I have not had such a message, but I eagerly await it.
Moving on, have the opposition folks reached out to you, Dan, or have you reached out to them?
Well, people have reached out to me at an informal level and at times directly. I have had conversations with people in the opposition in a number of places. 2 years ago I was in Addis Ababa and I met with people from the opposition there. I have spoken at forums that were organized by a number of different groups. I have met with members of the EPDP at various times, and also people in the Salvation grouping and others. I will talk to any Eritrean nationalist, whatever the tendency, background, or association is. I have at the same time tried to take a lesson from the experience of the 1970s and 80s, where I think I let myself get too caught in sectarian divisions within the society, and I have stayed clear of participating in any specific organization. But I have talked to quite a few and will continue to talk to anyone who shares that, as I said, that vision of a peaceful, inclusive Eritrea in the future.
Dan, you were also close to the members of the G15 who have been incarcerated since 2001, while some have reportedly died or are in dire health conditions. Do you have any knowledge of their whereabouts or how they are faring?
I don't think I know any more about that than any of the rest of us. There have been lots of rumors and reports. I tend to treat every one of them with a grain of skepticism. I think, as you put it, there's no doubt that a number of the people who were imprisoned were suffering from various health problems to start with, and I doubt very much if they've all survived. And that those who have survived have done so in good health. I think it's a terrible crime against the country and its own history that all these people who helped build the country and win its independence have been treated this way. And I think there need to be some very hard answers to the question of what happened, why, and who's responsible for it. But I have no specific knowledge of the health or well-being of any of them.
Dan, I have to ask you this question. Have you or were you ever a member of the Central Intelligence Agency?
Never. It's remarkable the extremes to which the supporters of the government will go to try to discredit the messenger and avoid having to deal with the message. I have never worked for any government agency. In fact, I started an aid organization, Grassroots International, which you may be familiar with, which has a policy right from the beginning of not taking any government money. So it too would be independent. Another thing that has followed me is the notion that I write about Eritrea to make money off of it. And I think, frankly, if anybody really understood the profits to be made from writing about Eritrea, they would abandon that charge in a big hurry.
Dan, do you, as a reporter, at times the only one in Eritrea during the armed struggle, look back into the past and recall any data, or info for that matter, that you might have overlooked indicating the violent nature of the then EPLF? How was it able to escape any attention while it was actually engaged in a brutal crackdown and killing of its own fighters?
Well, I have to say that if you go back again and look at the paper that I put out in 2003, which is up on my website and is still available at allafrica.com, titled Enough. I listed a number of warning signs about the character of the regime. And of course, going back to my first involvement with the movement in the 1970s, I was hearing at that time stories about the Menka movement before I got there in 1973. I didn't understand the depths of that or the numbers of people who were arrested for being associated with it, who spent many years in EPLF presence. That was something I learned about in the mid to late 1990s. And I think, as I said in my own essay, there were enough signals that I should have asked more pressing questions. And I fault myself for that at this point. I would say at the same time that if you go back to the era of the national liberation struggles that took place throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, every movement was involved in a certain amount of internal violence and authoritarian behavior toward its membership and toward the citizenry. And that would include the African National Congress in its camps in Angola and Mozambique, the Palestinian movements, and many others. The depth and extent of the controls within the Eritrean movement distinguish it, but the fact of it behaving as a military and authoritarian movement that punished its own is not so distinctive. And I think the other thing that was very effective about it was that it kept a lid on many of these stories so that its members didn't talk about them much either. And that takes me back again to the fact that everybody who participated in this, whether observers like me, or fighters, or certainly anyone who held any share of command responsibility within the EPLF, needs to go back and unpack all that and say, where were the things that I did or saw or knew about that I didn't stand up and oppose, and how do we pull that out into the open now so that it can be left behind and not repeated?
Dan, there's been a steady stream of defectors from Eritrea.
Yes, but how many of them are standing up and saying, this is what I did?
Well, they have actually been more than willing to readily share the brutality of the regime since its inception. My question actually is, what surprised you most about new information coming out of these folks?
That's a tough one. I'm not sure that I can answer that. I've learned a lot from reading the accounts of people like Underbrahan. I've had some very interesting conversations with people like Wilde Jesus in the EPDP and with Mesfin Hagos and others. So learning the intricate details of events has been interesting. I have to say that the thing that surprised me the most was hearing Ali Abdu say, "Not me, I never did anything."
Well, how did that happen? Did you have direct contacts with him?
I read the submission that he made to the Australians for asylum there.
Dan, as you might know, we have escapees who are simply petrified that should they say anything about their experiences, the government would harm members of their families back home, which might explain their reluctance. Do you sense that?
Well, yes, actually, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate fear, and there is ample evidence that retribution has been taken against families. In many of the interviews that I've conducted with people who have left it at all levels, people ask that their last names not be used or that their names be entirely disguised for precisely that reason, and I respect that. I think that there's a level of involvement in this that as you get toward the top, though, that has with it a certain responsibility to clarify the situation and to acknowledge responsibility for participating in it. And I realize that carries risks, but for what has been done up to this point, I think people need to find ways to get that information out. However they do it, it has to be done. The idea that people who know the inside workings of this regime have found another reason to keep quiet about it simply, to me, adds another layer of responsibility for keeping it as it is.
Well, Dan, you are perceived by a whole lot of people as a friend of Eritrea who genuinely cares about the welfare of the country. Are you surprised or even disappointed by how things turned out? Why do you still keep in touch? And would you go back there and be a citizen and even run for office?
Well, I think of Eritrea as part of my family. I have a loyalty to family that transcends specific problems or conflicts. And I would say in this regard that, I've been involved in Eritrea for almost 40 years, which is a very long time. And it has become such a deep part of my life that, it's not a matter of choice anymore. How do you walk away from what is part of you? I would go back to Eritrea in a minute were the situation to change and for it to be safe and secure to do so. I don't see myself running for office there or anywhere else. I don't think that's my role in the world. I don't see myself as a leader of Eritrea. I see myself as a friend and family member. I hope that what I think, feel, and say has some value to others. But it's really time for a new generation of people to step up and carry Eritrea forward. And I would like nothing more than to see that happen and to be around when it does.
And on that optimistic note, we would like to thank you for availing yourself to do this interview and for articulating our nation's concerns, hopes, and aspirations. Dan, I would like you to have the last word.
Well, thank you, Rusum. I think the thing that is most important now is for everyone to find ways to get beyond the walls that they've put up between them, other people, other organizations, and other tendencies within the broad umbrella of Eritrean nationalism. This is a time where it's crucially important for people to start building bridges and creating relationships among people who are different from ourselves, who think differently, who have different politics, who have different ethnic or linguistic backgrounds, and start to create the basis for a post-dictatorship Eritrea. Nobody needs another speech or program. I think what people need more than anything else is actions that build confidence that everybody will have a place in Eritrea in the future, and that the efforts to reach out to people now prove it.
Thank you, Dan. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, son.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to a special presentation of Face the Erespora. Our guest was Dan Connell. Thank you for listening to our program. Until we meet again, goodbye.